Thanks a lot, everyone, and sorry for being late. There was a large group. We couldn't actually find the room. This is a joint work with Santiago Alvarez-Blaser, who's a graduate student at the University of Basel, currently visiting Harvard, Sarah Lein, and Andrei Levchenko. And like always, the views are mine and not those of the BIS. And what we study is the granular origins of inflation and its international co-movement. And of course, right now we've, since Xavier Gabec's seminal work on the issue, economists have successively looked into how granularity, so how the fact that naturally firm-sized distributions or many distributions are fat-tailed, and therefore the law of large numbers does not apply, and the large firms matter for aggregate fluctuations. For example, right, 1/3 of GDP fluctuations can be explained by how large firms face idiosyncratic shocks. We see actually many instances in life where one event that might be one ship blocking the Suez Canal actually cause macroeconomic trickle effect somewhere down the road. And certainly when we think about sort of the structure of retail price dynamics, and we think about how there are very, very large international corporations in there, we should be cognizant that this might be very relevant for inflation dynamics in general, maybe particularly so in the current backdrop. And here we just put one example. It's a year old, and it's where Unilever, which here it says sells Dove soaps and Lipton tea, said it would also raise prices beyond a 1% increase in the second quarter. So what we're really interested in this paper is if you have events like this, if you have a fat-tailed distribution of firms, how is that going to affect inflation at the national level, and how is it going to affect its international co-movement, in particular taking into account that these firms are multinational corporations that are present in many markets at the same time. What we're going to do is, I think a big part of the contribution is empirical, that we're going to look into inflation dynamics in a multi-country product level home scan data set. I'm going to be talking about this a bit more. It's going to be the equivalent to the Nielsen data we've just seen. It's going to be from a different data supplier, but essentially the same set of data, but it's going to be for 16 countries. And there's quite a lot of machinery of how you sort of merge this data, because the products are identified by barcodes, and across many markets, the same good will have different barcodes. And there are many issues like this. And we're going to second, because we have a data set that has a cross-country dimension, that has information on sort of the type of products. So we're going to call them product groups. Could be cereals, or could be beverages. And we're going to be able to associate products to manufacturers. So let's say there is a specific soup, and it's, I don't know which soup company. So let's say it's Knorr, right? And that is the brand that already has many products, and that is then owned by Unilever. So we can build that up. And actually we also know retailers, and retailers are very large too, so we have that information too. I'm not going to show it in the paper, because once you've done everything, it turns out that retailers don't matter. So it's not a Walmart or Aldi effect. It's really a Unilever effect. And we're going to look into this data set and splice up granularity by looking into firms, looking into products, and looking into categories. So as I said, I could even look into products within brands, within firms. I could look into retailers. We've already excluded these dimensions, but they're in the paper too. And we're going to look at this in the national sense and for international co-movement. And we're going to find that it's really about the firm component. So it's not about soups, or it's about the brands. It's really that there is a common pricing strategy at the very top level of a firm that has an impact on aggregate retail price inflation. And we're going to find that in this data, inflation co-movement is largely, I would say, driven by the granular component, but I don't want to imply causality here. It's that if you remove the granular component that is present in all countries, then co-movement of inflation is much lower than what we see in the actual data. I'm going to be more specific about this.
Sorry, Raphael.
Yes?
Are you suggesting that Unilever has a common pricing strategy at the brand level, if not at the product level, all across the world?
So these results are consistent with Unilever having a global pricing strategy for all brands across the board. I mean, we know we can ask them, but they will let. I trust what the data tells us. But yeah, no, I would think that they would actually be puzzled by that, because they probably have brand and market-specific pricing strategies, right? But still, you know, in the end, they coordinate across these units, across these countries. They have a production strategy. Yeah.
They have a lot of different production units scattered all over the world with different costs.
Yeah, but it seems like in the end, you know, when you look at how does granularity matter for aggregate inflation, you can collapse all that to the firm level. So yeah, I already gave my introduction. I'm going to be speaking at some length about the data, which I think is pretty cool. Then I'm going to be talking about the granular residual. Actually, I'm going to be talking about residuals, because we do like a multi-level splicing. I'm going to be talking a bit about co-movement across countries. And then I'm going to skip some slides on a granular IV specification that we're going to be currently implementing, and take stock. So about the data, the supplier that we have here is not Nielsen, it's IMARC. That is a foundation that tries to get sort of these other data provided, like Kantar and the how's it, German consumer panel, GfK. Yeah, they despite the German name, they're active in multiple countries, and we've gotten 16 countries from them. They actually have more, but the data quality is not very homogeneous, so we focus on these for the moment. We have data from 2005 till 2020. You know, home scan data hasn't been around for so long in many markets, so let's say 2008 till 20 is what we have for the modal country. And this is standard home scan data. It's one entry per product purchase. So household X goes to a supermarket, scans all the purchases, and records the price. And we have the household ID data set, the date of the purchase, the retailer, and all the product information. And there is a lot of concording if you want to speak about comparability across countries necessary. So what we do is, like, for example, I mean, so there is a number of things you need to keep in mind, right? So generally, you would start by thinking a UPC code, a scan code uniquely identifies a product. Already in national data, you have difficulties with that. For example, in the U.S., Target will have completely idiosyncratic UPC codes, and so you cannot compare Barilla spaghetti 1 pound in Target with Barilla spaghetti 1 pound, exactly the same specification elsewhere, because they will on purpose have made a different barcode, so consumers have a harder time comparing prices. But in an international level, so all these difficulties that you have when working with scanner data are a factor bigger, because, for example, it's going to be hard to find a 300 milliliter can or 330 milliliter can in the US. They're going to have ounces, and it's not going to be the same product. It's going to be very similar. The language might differ, right? And if it's the exact same product, but the language description, this is 500 grams of spaghetti from Barilla, 7-minute cooking time. If the language is different, the barcode is different. So what we do is we have information on the labeling, on the product name, and we use a fuzzy algorithm to match it, right? We can very well match the brands but even not that 100%. It's like might be Nestlé or Nestlé with an accent. You know, it's always a bit different, but that you can match really well. Then you can look into the subsplits of the data, and you have product descriptions, and you have the weight, and you can really match that and then you have like a 16-country product data set, and that's very hard to get, so it's a lot of data work. And then we could even observe this, right? When it's purchased here, we're gonna collapse that to the aggregate quarterly level. So we have for each good, we're going to look at the average price in a given quarter in a given market. We've also done it like in a given retailer, but again, that didn't turn out to matter. So here we're only looking at this. We start actually, so the raw data is 2.7 billion observations. Obviously, right then, if you want to look into a comparable data set and you have aggregated it to sort of the quarterly per country level, it becomes much less. It's, for example, 21 million in Argentina over the 10 years that we have that data. And in total, yeah. No, so this is the raw data, sorry. So this is 2.6 billion data points. We can look in generally how well does this data, that is, you know, always a specific set of goods bought by Nielsen or AI mark customers, how well does it correlate with official price indices in these special categories? And the answer is, like in much research that Raphael or Michael are working in, very well, right? They're taking great care to make this representative. And also you see in this data, and there you already go beyond what you see in official inflation forecasts, you see that across all countries and across all markets, you see a lot of concentration. So the top 10 firms cover 27% of expenditures. So here that would be Nestlé, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and so forth. In the U.S. or Germany, that I'm always going to show for expositional purposes, it's even higher. It's 31 or 44%.
Did you see an increase in this share over the 10 years?
I don't know. I don't have the answer. I wouldn't have a prior. I mean, these are longer run trends. It's true that if you have 15 years of data for Germany or the US, then you could already see something. So with this much said about the data and how we chain it, let me go into a decomposition. Let's first look at the normal standard GABX type decomposition, and that is any price index in country C and at point time is just a weighted sum of the individual prices, and we could speculate, you know, there's an average effect and then there is an idiosyncratic product effect, and then we could just subtract the average, and we would get to this just add the unweighted average and subtract it, so it's just plus here and minus here, and then very simple, here you get the unweighted price change in a certain period, or price, and here you get the granular residual. The fact that there are certain prices that are larger than average, and for example, let's say they all go up in a certain point in time, they go up more than average, and then you're going to have a positive granular residual. So that's really, it's a very simple context. There is no magic behind it. It's just the simplest thing you can do to estimate if you just look at averages, unweighted average, and then you look at the difference between the weighted average and the unweighted average, how important is that latter component? It's really not more than that. And if you look at that, for example, in Germany, then you can see this this capital pi is the granular residual, and it explains a lot of the inflation co-movement. So the difference between the inflation and this series, that would be sort of what the unweighted component explains, and they seem to be maybe the unweighted component is less important than the overall component. So it's really about the fact that there are specific price dynamics to large firms that matter a lot for the overall CPI. And you could show it for a number of advanced economies and you'd get the same picture, but then you might show it look at it in high inflation emerging market economies, and then you get a very different picture, which is that it's always about just average inflation, about all prices moving, and never, or to a very low extent, about the fact that there are large firms that are pricing differently. So, and this is, we're next going to go into a different decomposition, but we're still going to have the same artifact showing up again and again, that granularity is not in high inflation environments. Granularity is about low inflation environments where idiosyncratic pricing strategies might matter a lot. So as I said, we wanna go a bit deeper into the granularity and sort of look into layers. Is it driven by large firms having a lot of observations? Is it possible? Is it that some firms are concentrated in some shocks that have very large price dynamics, or is it about products rather than firms? So it's really about the standard cornflakes package, half a pound or whatever. That really is the granular component, and it's not about Kellogg's. So what we could do is we can splice this up, where we start with let's just specify prices as an average country component, a component of a sector in a certain country, a component of a manufacturer in a certain component, and the idiosyncratic component. So that's again just ad hoc specifying something, and then rewriting the price index that is always axiomatically a weighted price index over individual prices, and then just split up in a certain way, and then we're just going to call these components in a certain way. So here we've just defined things, we've not done anything, but then what we can do is we can estimate these things because we have the panel of prices where we see individual prices, and each good has a sector allocated to it, a producer allocated to it, and that's it in this decomposition, and then an idiosyncratic component. So these are just fixed effects, right? So you can estimate the fixed effects in a panel, and then you can add these fixed effects up in an unweighted sense, and that all, because then you demean, and that all goes into the overall mean, and then you weigh them up again in the residual component, and then you allocate that to the granularity component of the firm and the sectors. And here, again for Germany, so here I'm going to just show you the inflation, overall inflation in black, and the residual in orange. And then I'm going to add these two other components, so the three components add up to the black line. And I can do it again for many, many countries. Let me just sort of show you the results for Germany, where we see that both the sector effects and the manufacturing granularity sort of explains certain aspects, and in terms of variance, I would actually say it's the sectoral fixed effects that seem to matter. For the U.S., and again, just to confirm, for Argentina, we don't, again, we can't explain anything because granularity didn't have a bite in the very first part. So let me, what is sort of the explanatory power if we look at this a bit more systematically? We can run, again, a GABX type regression where we just look at what is actually the explanatory power of a granular component for actual average inflation. So that's the lowest hanging regression you can do, and you could do it for some time lags. Here, what I'm going to show you next will not have time lags, it will just be the contemporaneous correlation. And we can also calculate an R-square, where we probably want to, sort of take out some variation by looking at the within variation over and above of country fixed effects that are obviously going to explain something. How much do you explain? And we also want to look into the sort of a regression that looks into this aggregate component that is different, right, from the unweighted price changes because it subsumes all these unweighted fixed effects. And what we find is that I'm going to split this up for all countries and again without emerging markets where the action is, that if we look at just the manufacturing component, it is highly significant and it explains about 15% of the variation. When we also include the sort of this unweighted component that has a lot of information, right, because it is sort of an amalgam of all the fixed effects, then we can explain substantially more, and the partial impact of the manufacturer component is very substantial. Don't be thrown off by this number being very small and this partial R-square being much higher. That is due to the fact that here you explain a very different thing. You take out a lot of variation because you have this in the normalization, and then off the residual, the granular component can explain a lot. When you go to all countries, you see that even the within R-square of just the manufacturer component is already very high, over 50%. So you can pick this number, and as the relevant metric, right? There are different metrics. This one is just the within R-square, and this one also absorbs out this effect of sort of this amalgam of the fixed effects. And still, the manufacturing granularity component can explain over 50% of the variation in inflation. We just want to look at what if we just restrict ourselves to the top 10 firms, so really the large players. And again, here in the sample of without emerging markets, we can explain about 50% of the variation in inflation just by the granular component of the 10 largest firms. It's just the firm granular component. So it's not about sectors. It's really about just firms being large within their sectors. Let me wrap it up by showing this graph. Can we actually also explain international inflation co-movement by the fact that we have large firms that are present in multiple markets? To some extent. So what I show you here is the correlation of two countries, A and C, and the correlation of their price changes. The correlation, and here how that relates to the weight in common manufacturers. So those firms that can be observed in both markets, what is the average expenditure share on these goods across the two markets? And we see that sort of there is some, for overall inflation, there is some mild, it's very low, the correlation is 0.2. There is some mild upward tendency. If you tend to have the same manufacturers present in both markets, then you tend to have inflation that co-moves. But interestingly, this is much higher. It's not like it's not super strong, but it's much higher if you repeat the same exercise and take as the dependent variable the average correlation of the granular component, so presence of multinationals makes the granular component co-move more. And actually, if you then do the opposite of this, so you subtract the granular component from this, which is done here, then again you can explain even less. So the co-movement that you see here is very little. All of it is due to the granular residual, and none of it is due to just average prices co-movement. It's really about granularity. Obviously, what I'm showing you here is not super strong. So yeah, we split that up, but let me stop here and open the floor for questions.
Yes, so ready for some questions?
Thanks. Very, very fascinating. And I wanted to ask, have you dug a little bit deeper in the differences to emerging markets? Because, I mean, just trying to rationalize it a little bit, it would mean that the product market and emerging market looks very different than advanced economies. Is that something you could look into? Like, for example, is there less concentration in the presence of multinational in certain product groups, for example? I mean, if I understand your results correctly here, in addition to this.
Yeah, so we have a bit of a tendency of focusing on the countries where we see the granularity at work. So I can only speculate, but I think, there are two things. And I think certainly these channels that you mentioned must be at work. But I also think, by and large, even if you have the exact same market structure in two countries, and one is in a 10 or 20% inflation environment, and the other one is in a 2% inflation environment, it's just that these pricing strategies that might affect one firm, like Unilever, will show up much more, right, in this low inflation environment. In fact, we're updating our data by a year. We might look into, the relative importance before COVID and now in this high inflation regime, and there we can really compare, like, sort of different aggregate price dynamics within the same markets. But my prior is that, it's really about these reasons that sort of just the, if everybody's increasing their prices every year by 20%, sort of the relative importance of my pricing strategy as a large firm is just much attenuated compared to an environment with low inflation.
Okay, so it's the high or low inflation environment.
That's my prior. I don't know.
Yeah. On the origins of inflation, the granular origins of inflation, is there, I understand that firm that is larger may have a higher price on average, but I'm not sure why this firm will have a more volatile price, more volatile inflation rate than a fully competitive firm. Think of two extremes, a fully competitive firm and a full monopolist. Is it true that independent of the source of the shock, the price of a monopolist is more volatile than the fully competitive firm?
I actually need to check that, but you don't need that, right? What you need for the granular component to be relevant is just that from period to period, average prices go in direction A, and the prices of the larger firms, like with this weighing behind, go in a different direction. And maybe it's offset the next period, right? But even you don't need systematically higher volatility or systematically different price trends. I mean, we do, for the sample, we do see sometimes systematically different price trends. But you don't need that, right? You just need, for some years, or the prices, or for some quarters, that's enough, the prices of the large firms go in that direction and the prices of the other firms go in a different direction, and then the granular component will matter. I think that the point is what you make of it, right? Is it sort of what is the macroeconomic relevance of these price differences? They certainly affect the CPI. We can measure that. Those are, you know, those will show up in the CPI. I think the economically important point is we've seen prices coming down due to, you know, I guess for 20 years due to, you know, so global supply chains increasing and growing. And then since the GFC, we've also seen some price dynamics. And the question is always, you know, where they're different across large and small firms. And now that we're seeing, again, right, very strong price dynamics, are they different across large and small firms? And sort of, and all these patterns, how large and small firms react differently to different underlying shocks, how does then sort of, what does this imply for sort of our macroeconomic modeling? I think that's the question. So.
Hi, Colin Hopman, Federal Reserve. I was going to say, when I think about granular origins of inflation, I was thinking more about the TSMC shock. We have a single company hit by a shock that affects so many downstream industries from an input-output perspective, which is very different, right? You're thinking here specifically about, you know, I'm a consumer products company operating in multiple countries and, you know, having common pricing or common marginal cost component, but there's a supply chain thing which could also amplify the shock to a particular company, which is very different. I just wanted to raise that as a, you know, alternative way of thinking about this question.
Yeah, I mean, right, that's how we often think about granularities, that these about input-output relationships and how certain upstream shocks trickle down. And I certainly agree that that's at work very often. Here, keep in mind, right, we only have retail prices, so there is no input from firm A used by firm B. That's, you know, within, like, Unilever doesn't go to a supermarket and buy some other competitor as its input. And the fact that we do have, and I think that's important, that we do have these sector shocks in there, I think that absorbs sort of any input-output consideration you might have. And then it's really on top of sort of sectoral shocks, how important are firm shocks? So I totally agree with what you say. I agree that we should take granularity and input-output settings very seriously, but there seems to be something else going on here at the retail level.
Okay, well, thanks, Raphael, for including our paper. This is joint work with Olivier, Coibion, Yuriy, Gorodnichenko, and kind of like, you know, what we're trying to do through the lens of household service is kind of figuring out, like, you know, how did the households potentially perceive, like, you know, the shock? Was it supply or demand driven? Because, like, you know, as we just heard in the policy panel, you know, early on we stumbled into the pandemic, and, you know, many of us were kind of figuring out, is it now driven to by supply or demand shocks, or how much of either? Similar policymakers faced a similar struggle. And so, like, you know, if we think back then in March and April of 2020, going to the grocery store, like, you know, we faced kind of shortages of many goods. So, you know, very popular one was toilet paper, and so then consumers had to do a kind of a similar inference problem. Was now the stock out of toilet paper, because, like, we all went nuts, you know, rushing to the store and kind of stockpiling, in which case, you know, at some point maybe we could be confident that actually there's a restocking going on, and so it might only be temporary, or potentially was it due to, you know, disruptions in supply chains, and then potentially it would be more permanent, or maybe which fraction of those two stories is it? And so the way we want to actually look at that is through the lens of subjective expectations. So, like, you know, what Lein said earlier, you know, trying to actually elicit expectations jointly and then understand through the co-movement to potentially shocks or revisions to understand then how potentially, you know, households might have interpreted the nature of the shock. And so, like, you know, in the data we do see, you know, as early as you know, April 2020 with a survey in the field, in April 2nd to 7th, that on the onset inflation expectations spike. And here I might actually disagree a little bit with some of the things that were said in the policy panel earlier. You have to work really, really hard to to make those spikes disappear in the data, and I can talk a bit how you can make those disappear later on a little bit. Just in the raw data, if it just collapses by date, you do see quite noticeable a large spike in inflation expectations. But at the same time, we actually also saw quite substantially a rise in disagreement, and the question is, where does this rise in disagreement come from? Is it because, Raphael and I participating in the survey disagree of what the nature of the shock is, supply versus demand driven, or is it that we all think it's the same type of shock, but we disagree on the severity of the shock, and to the extent maybe, we kind of form our expectations, I come back to that, why we might think that this might be relevant, to kind of the signals we observe in our daily lives. Is it then the case to that extent that, we do a kind of receive different signals in our daily shopping bundle because we consume different type of goods? Or is it for the same type of goods, we just pay different prices? That's kind of some of the things we want to actually understand through the lens of these surveys. And so the way we do that, so we've been fielding since 2018 quarterly surveys on what is called the Nielsen Home Scan panel. I'll tell you a little bit more about the structure of this panel and which type of things we observe for panelists in a second. We in our current survey have 25,000 respondents. And then the nice feature of this panel is you do observe pretty much at the weekly frequency what did people purchase in their non-durable consumption bundle. The way this works is if you're part of this panel, you go to the grocery store, to the pharmacy and stuff like that. Whatever you purchase at home, you have an optical scanner, you scan the good. And if it's actually purchased at a store that participates in the Nielsen retail panel, the price would be directly imputed from this point of sales. Otherwise, you have to manually enter that. And then we do observe what people purchase, what they pay, coupon, discount usage, which type of store, and so on. And based on this data, we then actually want to create, on the one hand, realized inflation at the household level, link this then up to what people expect inflation to be over the next 12 months, but then also trying to understand, as people adjust their inflation expectations, how do they also adjust their other expectations, in particular the unemployment expectations. And so what we see in a second is at the onset, the prices of goods people purchase frequently, think of milk, beer, and stuff like that, spiked quite tremendously early on in the pandemic. And we also see actually quite a sharp increase in realized inflation at the onset of the pandemic, and a big chunk of this increase is due to heterogeneity in shopping bundles and less so due to differences in prices paid. And then we actually show that, if you now have higher realized inflation in your non-durable shopping bundle, this also is associated with higher overall inflation expectations. And actually, I'll show you in a bit, actually this effect is actually strongest for low income and lower education households. And then overall, now studying expectations jointly, we do see that there's this pervasive kind of supply side view of the economy on the side of households. People updated upwards their inflation expectations hand in hand with higher unemployment expectations, which could potentially tell us something that this is a more, through the lens of households, a supply side disruption. And then we also see that a big chunk of the increase in the dispersion of expectations can be traced back to increased dispersion in realized inflation. Now I want to just briefly actually motivate a little bit why, trying to understand inflation expectations based on kind of shopping behavior and what people kind of see and do in their daily life. Luckily, Raphael is here, so he can take over the second slot of the session. Then, based on some recent work we've been doing with Francesco D'Acunto and Ulrike Malmandier, and so the starting point of this line of work was the fact that, across countries, surveys, and kind of time periods, you tend to see that, everyone has kind of upward biased expectations. This is data from the New York Fed between 2013 and 2018, realized inflation below 2%. Everyone is upward biased, but the upward bias is actually, in fact, substantially stronger for women than for men. That's when we started working on these topics in 2015, Anil Kashyap kind of completely derailed the seminar and said, well, unless you can explain to me where this comes from, you will never get tenure in Chicago. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, so let's actually see then what we came up with trying to actually rationalize this figure. And this is in our own survey that we did in 2015, also on this Nielsen panel. And the nice feature of the Nielsen panel is that you can observe and survey male and female household head from within the same household. So previous figure was across households. Here what we do, just condition of the same household, keeping constant family structure, household income and stuff like that might matter for expectations. And here we do in the left panel just unconditionally within household, what is the average gap, female expectations for 12-month head inflation versus male. And you do see also in this survey there's kind of an upward sort of gender gap in inflation expectations of about 0.4 percentage points. The only thing we do in the right plot, we separate households into those that we call more traditional households, where the male household head declares within the survey to never participate in grocery shopping, versus, more, progressive households or whatever you want to call them, where the household head declares to at least once in a while partake in grocery chores. And you do see like the gender gap, increases by maybe 40% in those more traditional households, instead completely disappears in those more progressive households. And the reason for that is also the male household head in these households has higher inflation expectations. And I've heard in various occasions that supposedly at one of the first Christmas parties at the ECB, I guess when he was taking over the head of the presidency, that our French former president of the ECB was supposedly saying that, don't ask me about inflation, ask my wife. Maybe Frank can confirm that, I'm not sure about that. Anyways, and so like, you can actually directly ask households, what do you think, or which type of information sources are the most relevant for you when forming inflation expectations? And all these type of things on the x-axis were just provided in randomized order. The three most important ones, the first most important one got a score of 3, 2, and 1. And you see just predominantly people just say, my own shopping is really the most important. And then you also see that if you just link up what is realized at the household level, and I'll tell you how we did that in a second. Here just non-parametrically raw data, all the way to the left, lowest realized inflation at the household level over the previous 12 months, non-durable consumption bundle, highest realized inflation, and we just collapse the survey data. What do people think is inflation over the next 12 months for overall CPI inflation, that we define what inflation is? And you do see that those actually in general, like, the upward bias we discussed earlier, but you see that those with the highest personal inflation realized in their own non-durable consumption bundle have about a 0.5, 0.6 percentage point higher average expected inflation rate relative to those with the lowest realized inflation. So like, the reason why I wanted to show that is like, just to kind of share with you some of the evidence why I personally, like Olivier and Yuriy, also think that, daily price signals we observe day to day are really important. And so like, I want to now go a little bit more into detail what we do in this paper today, just to give you a little bit of some flavor. Unfortunately, only some rough overviews, like, Nielsen panel, 80,000 households, data from 2004 up to now. And so what you observe there, as we discussed earlier, it's just pretty much whatever people purchase in their non-durable consumption bundle, smaller durable items also in there, pretty much anything that has a barcode. And then, they purchase it in the store. When they're at home, they use the optical scanner, and that's kind of the type of data we have access to, which we then can use to hopefully kind of create this measure of realized inflation at the household level for the non-durable consumption bundle. Now, at some point in 2015, we figured out actually that you can actually run surveys on this panel, and normally kind of large consumption producers like Coke or so is running these type of surveys when they actually want to introduce a new variety, just to make sure they don't have a flop when actually they introduce a new Coke variety. They actually would try to survey kind of consumers to get an idea what they would think of this type of product. And so like starting then in 2018, we've had those kind of quarterly surveys running actually up till now. At the end of the year, unfortunately, our NSF grant is up, and we try to somehow get in continuation. So if there are any sponsors out there, or just tell me afterwards. And so the nice feature of this panel, as you already saw earlier, is just the sheer number of people. We've on average like 25,000 households relative to the Michigan survey or like the New York Fed. Just means that you can actually, oftentimes we do information treatments in those surveys, just to actually have many treatments at the same time within the same panel, and then to understand how different framings of information and stuff like that might be differentially successful in shifting expectations. and then like, a response rate of about 25%. Now, realized inflation, how we do that? As we mentioned, like pretty much things we buy at the grocery store. And now, of course, like there are a couple of challenges if you want to now create like, more high frequency measure of realized inflation at the household level, especially like during the pandemic where we have switching across stores, across type of individual goods. And so like what we do is actually we focused on effective prices at the product module level. So instead of now saying like we need to purchase the same type of milk across like, quarter to quarter to be able to measure, we just say, well, forget about that. Instead, let's actually focus on things like, dairy products or baking soda and stuff like that. So a little bit more aggregated stuff to allow directly for the substitution across like individual brands and across outlets. That's what we do here. So like what we call here, this is an effective price where we just look at like, how much did you spend in a certain quarter on a certain module, and what was the volume of what you purchased. This is then the effective price at the module level, and then we just create an inflation rate or price change at the module level, and then we aggregate it up to get a measure of realized inflation, where we just weight by expenditure shares, and here again to allow for switching across categories over time, or substitution across categories. It's the average expenditure share from the current and the previous quarter. So that's then what we actually now plot in the second, and then we have tons of other expectations, and I actually mentioned them along the way. Inflation expectations as the New York Fed directly for inflation rather than prices in general, point estimate, distribution, expectations, and perceptions. Okay, so like there's this literature also like Craig Kaplan, Sam Schuler-Verwohl, and others that document there's a huge amount of dispersion in realized inflation. But most of the time, like in normal times, there's actually very little systematic association. Meaning that if you disaggregate by gender, by income, by education, by location, there's no systematic variation in realized inflation across those categories. Of course, this doesn't mean that once a recession hits, and you might actually do a kind of a trading down from maybe Whole Foods going to Trader Joe's, or maybe actually you purchase peculiar goods that saw a especially large increase in prices, that in a kind of COVID-19 pandemic, this could potentially be different. So that's what we now want to just do. So here what we are plotting is like realized inflation quarter to quarter. So like to understand now annual differences, you want to multiply potentially by 4. And so here we first look actually disaggregated by race. So like let's see maybe in blue white survey participants and black survey participant stash, and you see like before the pandemic not really any systematic differences. If you multiply by 4, you also get like a number that the BLS was reporting, roughly around 1% food inflation before the pandemic. Then you see actually early on immediately it spikes up, and you do see now actually quite substantial differences opening up by race. So if you multiply that by 4, you see like differences in realized inflation across white and black panelists in Nielsen of about 2 or 2.5 percentage points. Similarly, if you do a disaggregation by income, before the pandemic, similar trends across income groups that we get from Nielsen. But then actually you see like the highest income household had like a 4 percentage point annualized difference or lower inflation rate than the lowest income households. Again, quite substantial differences, somewhat smaller differences by education. And so now what we briefly want to just actually shed some light on, we have a way more formal discussion on that in the paper. It's like, what is now driving this dispersion in realized inflation that we do see in the data? And actually, like, I don't know, I'm not a priest, and you are not, I guess, in the chapel or so, meaning like, whenever you actually have questions, just feel free to interrupt me. Yes?
I mean, when I think about the pandemic, I think about products being unavailable. Right?
Yes.
Your measures have that. You could have done a CES thing, very simple. You could have captured it. I'm not sure it changes entirely your story, but have you done that? Have you thought about that?
No, that's a good point. So we at some point discussed whether we would want to allow for that. And so like, it's true that at some point earlier on toilet paper was out of stock, but not for the whole quarter. So like, I think that's partially would address that. Thank you. Okay, and so like, what we want to understand now a little bit in a simple graphical form, what is actually now driving the kind of the gap opening up in realized inflation across households that we saw previously. And so like, the first thing we just do here, like, realized inflation across different modules. Remember, we created at the module level the effective price change over time. And here we're just plotting now different percentiles of this distribution. And kind of what you see here now earlier in the pandemic, this dispersion just opens up, meaning like, there's a more dispersion in realized price changes in the cross-section of product modules in Nielsen. Now, paired with in case we actually differ in which type of modules we are purchasing, this can actually then give us an increase in realized inflation. Here just, for individual modules, just to give you an idea how the data look like. I don't know, what is this here? Like, I think this one is here is eggs. Like, earlier in the pandemic, this is still 12 months now. You see like an increase in egg prices of 12% on average in this Nielsen panel. If you now buy lots of eggs, you're not really hurt by that. Instead, if you buy, I think down here somewhere, candy, they didn't actually have a noticeable increase in prices. So like, if you pair that with heterogeneity in consumption bundles, this can actually drive some of the differences we saw. Instead, actually, if you now look at across household within product module dispersion, there is quite a bit of dispersion, but actually there's no noticeable spike at the onset of the pandemic. Now, if we put those two pieces together, to us, that's actually indicative that this increase in realized inflation is largely driven by actually different bundles and less strongly so by different kind of prices paid. And we do a more formal decomposition in the paper where we actually put numbers on that. It's about 2/3 is due to different goods purchased and about 1/3 due to differences in prices paid. Now I want to actually talk a little bit then how realized inflation is associated with inflation perceptions and inflation expectations, and then close at the end understanding this joint movement of inflation expectations and unemployment expectations. So here this is now just simply expected inflation from point forecast in this Nielsen home scan panel. What do you think is the inflation rate over the next 12 months, where we first define what inflation is? And here, I have to say, like, these are now Huber robust means, so already kind of somewhat down weighting, like extreme observations. The raw data would be even higher. And so, like, what you see in the left panel, like in blue, like, average expected inflation rate, as I mentioned earlier, with quarterly kind of was first trending down, and then, however, was spiking up. And then, as the kind of a pandemic progressed, came down again, and then, like, the summer of 2021 hit, and again, you see this noticeable spike in inflation expectations. And like, given that we use this information for some other paper, like if you look at the summary of economic projections from June of 2021 by the FOMC, you saw that they expected for 2021 an inflation rate of 1.6%. This time for once households were actually very closer, and because they actually expected a really high degree of inflation going forward. And there's a pretty strong co-movement also with the dispersion or a measure of standard deviation on the right-hand side. Now here what we're just simply doing is doing an association between like realized inflation at the household level in the non-durable consumption bundle against the expected inflation from the survey. And you do see actually, there's somewhat of a positive association, like, those that have actually a very high realized inflation also expect a way higher inflation going forward. It's not super strong because, of course, as we discussed earlier, we ask for overall inflation. We only measure like very specific type of goods. Then, like, there's some evidence in some of our prior work that it's actually like oftentimes individual goods people would actually focus on when forming inflation expectations. And so like a frequency weighting instead of like a frequency of purchase weighting instead of expenditure shares is really, really important. But here we just actually wanted to show this association. And then instead actually more directly focus on like what we also listed in the survey. What do you think was inflation over the last 12 months? And if you recall the previous figure, kind of actually looks already very similar. It's like, you also saw first trending down a little bit and then spiking up, coming down and spiking up again. So like, again, like earlier in the pandemic and in the summer of last year. And so if you then actually just do a simple bin scatter plot, what do you expect inflation over the next 12 months versus perceived inflation? And now actually we do it separately. all the waves before the pandemic, so Q1 of 2018 until Q1 of 2020, and then Q2 of 2020 until like, mid 2021, you do see like, there's this pretty tight link, and this link actually hasn't changed over time. It's not like, the way people tend to think about inflation has changed dramatically. It's still the case that when they think about inflation, if they think right now it's really high, they expect high inflation going forward. So ultimately, to understand inflation expectations dynamic, we have to understand, how they form perceptions, like the price at the pump, the price of salient goods. So this is something, I think that's a key takeaway from here. And so like, now actually, given that I advertised it at the very beginning of the motivation, ultimately we want to understand, how through the lens of household expectations, they perceive the nature of the shock. And we want to now understand whether it's, normal times, there's been now a couple of papers like Carola Binder, Rupal Kamda, or also like, Johannes Wohlfahrt and Chris Roth that actually have noticed that it is often the case that, Raphael, that's nice new work on like the path through of inflation expectations to wage expectations, that, people seem to kind of dislike inflation and they associate inflation with really bad things happening in terms of high unemployment, in terms of like the economy tanking. And so like we want to understand whether this is actually also what's going on during the pandemic, or at least early on the pandemic, or whether people perceive the nature of the shock potentially differently. Or saying it differently is like we want to understand like, whether the higher dispersion in inflation expectations is now because Raphael and I disagree on like kind of the size of the shock, or is it because we disagree on the nature of the shock? Okay, like the first thing, of course, then we have to look at, like, what do people actually expect that the unemployment will be over the next 12 months? Similar structures earlier, like we define what the unemployment rate is, and then we just simply ask them, what do you think will it be over the next 12 months? Simple point estimate. And here what you see, like, unemployment expectations similar to inflation expectations in normal times, somewhat upward biased, but, also trending downward somewhat. Then actually the recession hit, they jumped up, and then came down again. And so like, if you already kind of superimpose the two kind of figures, you kind of already can guess what our answer will be. Because like, if we now focus on like the association between expected unemployment over the next 12 months versus expected inflation over the next 12 months, pre-COVID in black, and the COVID waves in red, you tend to see actually, and actually, maybe it's a bit of an unfortunate plot, so like, those over here, it's about like 20% of the data, but for most of our sample, there's actually a pretty tight, strong, upward sloping association. Those that expect higher unemployment are also those that expect higher inflation. And, it somewhat flattens out over here. But again, this is of course only correlation. Now, however, the nice feature of the data is that it has actually a huge panel component. And so unless you actually stop scanning and are kicked out by Nielsen, you actually keep being in the survey wave after wave. So therefore, what we can do to get at least a little bit more closer to a more causal interpretation of this association, we can actually now study at the individual household level how they jointly update their unemployment expectations and their inflation expectations from before the pandemic to during the pandemic. And that's kind of what we are doing here in this plot. So this is now the revision in expected unemployment rates over the next 12 months from the pandemic waves relative to the pre-pandemic waves against the revision in inflation expectations. Same difference, pandemic waves, pre-pandemic waves, and you tend to see actually like, if you are someone that updates upwards your inflation, unemployment expectations, you're also updating upwards your inflation expectations. So like, it looks more like, we all kind of disagree on like, how bad is it really? And then actually this depends on like how we update our inflation and unemployment expectation. It's not that we differ in types of like the type of shock or how we update jointly inflation and unemployment expectations. And so like with that, I want to conclude here. And so like in this paper, we try to understand on the one hand, like, what might actually driving household expectations in general for inflation, but also then how jointly households update their unemployment and inflation expectations to get a little bit of a better sense through the lens of household expectations, how they perceive the nature of the shock. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. We started a little bit late, so we'll take 3 minutes for questions.
Hi, Michael Kiley, Federal Reserve. Just to think about your supply shock interpretation of the correlation between, inflation expectations and the unemployment rate. Do you notice any difference between those, maybe of different ages or some other way where they may actually have more experience with supply shocks versus demand shocks, right? Because I think in most of your sample, sort of inflation is potentially dominated by demand shocks. And I think an alternative interpretation, and this is something that I've seen like Alan Blinder talk about in the Wall Street Journal, right, is just that people think inflation's bad and they think unemployment is bad, and so they see something bad happening, and so there's other bad things are going to happen, and it's not really about supply shocks.
Yeah, no, so like actually this positive correlation also in revisions of unemployment and inflation, it's actually very pervasive. So like you just look at the differences by income, education or stuff, you don't really find that for some it's weaker or stronger. It's like a really pervasive feature. And so like, this paper by Chris Roth and Johannes Wohlfahrt, they actually exactly make this point. It's like, they call it a good-bad heuristic. There's some things they perceive as good, others they perceive as bad, and they think they are co-moving. That's totally consistent exactly with the correlations we show here. So like it's through the lens of an economic model, I call that still a supply shock, but then of course, like if you would want to feed it back into a model, we would have to more carefully think about that.
Thanks, Michael. Just one question. So are we sure that they understand the concept of aggregate inflation? So because maybe, just ask the question, what's inflation, in 12 months' time? And they just think about the bundle. So the answer is completely rational and correct. And also, do you have an idea about the decision they are taking is based on the, or the savings or whatever economic relevant decision are based on this concept of aggregate inflation or the actual inflation in their panel?
No, that's two fantastic questions. So like, in this setup, it could be the case they totally misinterpret what we're asking them, even though we clearly define overall US inflation. But then they're still not good forecasters for their own realized inflation in the future. Because instead of sorting on realized inflation, this is now still the sorting on past realized inflation, and then you plot instead of expected inflation, you plot realized inflation over the next 12 months. It's pretty of your own bundle, it's pretty flat. And the reason for that is, most of the price changes pretty temporary in the grocery domain. That's why we typically strip them off from core inflation. And so like, they might still think about like, their own stuff, but certainly they're not good forecasters of that. And in fact, actually, I skipped over that earlier. You can actually ask people, like, when you think about inflation, are there specific goods that come to mind? And the answer is yes. So most people don't think about, representative consumption bundle and prices and stuff. Like, we have a new paper with Francesco where we show that, if you perceive a high milk price change over the last 12 months, and just purely milk, and we can actually match it up with the realized prices they paid for milk, you have a way higher overall inflation expectation. So like, I do think that households have a very different concept of most households with inflation in mind than what we would have. And now, what matters for their decisions, so like Oli, Yuriy and I, we have a recent paper in the June JP where we actually do like, information experiments on those panelists. And so like, now of course it doesn't mean that in normal times they would behave this way, but if you as a policymaker can actually reach them, provide information, we show they update their overall inflation expectations, and subsequently in actual scanner data, also their spending. So like, you show it in surveys, the surveys could say, well, maybe they just say whatever just to make them answer consistently, but they actually do also change their decision after the intervention over the next 6 months. Those that to our treatments have exogenously higher inflation expectations go out and spend more in line with the Euler equation.
Okay, I will rush over there, but please keep it very brief.
Hi. Can it be just a timing issue that, agents think that, there's inflation is going up, central banks will raise rates that will cause a recession, unemployment will go up eventually. So I'm not sure from your questions in the survey how you deal with this.
Not totally. So like, you know, at least in the survey, we say, well, over the next 12 months. And so then, unless you had some differential persistence that, you know, you would think, let's say, inflation first will stay somewhat elevated, maybe because, you know, sticky prices versus maybe unemployment is responding more quickly. You know, that could certainly be plausible. The reason why I don't think that's happening is because if you look at, like, you know, now instead of only looking at 1 year ahead expectations, how longer ahead, like, you know, 5 years ahead expectations move, they actually move very similar to what I showed here, which is why I think that it's less likely, but I certainly cannot rule it out.
All right, and I also, so a couple prefatory remarks. As in all of the sessions, as we heard at the panel earlier, and when Raphael was speaking, the views expressed are my own and not those of the Federal Reserve. I think secondarily, I'm probably going to squint a little bit at the screen. I happen to have eye surgery less than a week ago, and still you're all a little fuzzy. Please feel free to jump in and ask questions, and I may not see you raise your hand if you're way in the back, in which case just shout out. And I think we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. Okay. So my paper is about the degree of anchoring in inflation, and exactly how much information should we have for our current views of inflation from the experience in the last 20 years. So, you know, we all know that inflation was low and stable for a couple of decades, you know, but jumped out of that low and stable range last year. So, you know, a natural question is, you know, what's going to happen in the future? Right? That's a lot of what, you know, and especially in December or late last year when this paper was written, you know, how should we think about the relevance of the very different dynamics of inflation across different episodes? You know, the experience of the last 2 decades was very different from that of the second half of the 20th century, right? Inflation has been very transitory, to use a word that we're not allowed to use anymore. Prior to the recent years, right? And so a lot of questions of like, just how transitory is it going to be in the future, right? What does the different data suggest? So this question is just going to be about, well, how might we combine different views, right? And it's going to ask it in a particular way. It's going to highlight the degree of information in data, right? And so I think the application, I'm going to try to be really simple and straightforward, and then try to link it back to how we often are using macroeconomic data to inform our views on the outlook and how robust some of those procedures are. Right? That's something that's come up in some other papers that I've written on different topics. Okay, so the contribution is really simple. I'm going to apply the approach of a Bayesian decision maker. Now, I'm going to say a Bayesian decision maker, right? Not the Bayesian decision maker, because any Bayesian analysis makes a ton of assumptions, right? This is going to be a very particular way of putting a Bayesian lens on a question. I'm going to ask, how should we combine, you know, experience over the last couple decades with any plausible other views of what inflation might look like, right? And how much information in that 21st century experience would a Bayesian decision maker use to update his views on inflation, depending on what those prior views were, right? What that's going to do is really highlight the low level of information in recent data. And we'll talk about why the recent data has a low level of information, but it's really not very complicated. At least in the United States, one can think of inflation over the years from 2000 to 2019 as constant at 2%. Right? There was noise. Let's just say it was constant at 2%. If inflation was constant at 2% for 20 years, right? What's your best estimate of inflation? Well, it's going to be 2%. Right? Of course, in that alternative world, which is not exactly the world we lived in, where inflation was constant for 2%, you would be very surprised if 1 year inflation were 5%. And you might say, actually, there's no information in the data. I've never seen that happen before. And that's exactly what the econometric analysis is going to say. It's to say, gosh, what happened in 2021 was impossible, according to what happened. And so there's just no information in the data. Whereas if it looks a lot like what happened in earlier periods. And so those earlier periods may be weighted relatively highly in thinking about inflation. Okay. And that's just an example in the context of this inflation process. This is actually an example that shows up many times when we do macroeconomic analysis with aggregate time series data, right? Just actually is much less informative than we might expect. And choices, prior choices, if you're a frequentist econometrician, those prior choices might be in terms of the specification you use or the types of data, what you allow in your model, right? Or in a formal Bayesian analysis, it might be in terms of a formal prior, right? Those affect outcomes a great deal. And that's sort of why the more sophisticated or richer sort of analyses looking at not aggregate data, like the previous two papers, really may be ways to inform views, more richly. Okay, so of course there's a big literature on the inflation process, and a lot of that literature, right, has basically two conclusions that can be summarized as one, conclusion. In the U.S., inflation between 2000 and 2019 is a constant at 2% plus noise, right? And that's that inflation is very transitory, and there's almost no Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is very flat, right? And so there's a large literature on both of those things, and that literature actually is very influential, right? And so, while I cite a lot of papers here, one important thing to note, and I think it has affected decision making, right, is that some of these papers are written by people who actually are or have been policymakers in the United States, right? So it's clear that these sorts of views, right, we all know they're very influential, right? But I think they're even more influential than we all think, right? That these are deeply embedded views, right, based on, actually in the time series of U.S. data, maybe not a lot of information. Right? Now there's a second set of literature, and here I'm going to be very brief, right? There's lots of approaches to taking Bayesian analysis in macro problems. In terms of inflation, right, I think there are sort of two primary approaches, right? One, it's often used in sort of structural time series models of projecting inflation, right? But there, the Bayesian techniques are not often used in the way that I'm going to use them, right? About, well, how informative is the data? Right? They're often being used as, well, I have various views on the prior, and I have a very complicated model that might be very difficult to estimate using traditional techniques, or maybe even impossible, and this Bayesian approach is going to help me, right? So actually, one might argue that that Bayesian approach is being used for reasons that are not especially Bayesian. Those people don't have necessarily strong views on the prior, right? It's more a tool for helping use the data, or at least that's my view. And I think there are lots of papers like that, in a pure time series approach. An early one was the paper I cite by Giorgio Primatieri, but there's a lot there. Obviously, I think in the DSG literature, Frank may not agree that that's how he and I and others have used Bayesian approaches, but I would certainly agree that that's how I have used them in those DSG contexts, as ways to help me approach the data rather than as having strong views on what the actual priors are. Okay. I think then there's I've written several papers in the last couple of years just about how the data are telling us very little about certain issues, right? And so in the literature on the equilibrium real interest rate, right, I have a series of papers where a lot of the results in the literature stem very, very directly from the priors that those people are bringing, whether it's in terms formally of the prior, right, how sensitive the posteriors are to choices about the priors, so I've demonstrated that, or even in non-Bayesian approaches where the prior is, I make these very specific assumptions. So like, for example, the Lovac and Williams papers, which are great papers, right, they don't formally use Bayesian methods, right, but of course they do make very strong assumptions on the structure of their model. Okay. And those assumptions really do lead somewhat linearly to the results. Okay. So what am I going to do? It's going to be super duper simple. I'm only going to look at two data series. Right? One is, it's going to be in a Phillips curve. So my Bayesian decision maker has a Phillips curve framework for thinking about inflation. His framework is really simple. He looks at core inflation. I'm going to use the core CPI. That's the chart here on the top. And what one can see, right, this is the histories from the 1960s through the present, is that if one were looking only at the last 2 decades, which is very common in central bank research, at least in the United States, inflation was basically constant at 2, nothing happened. until last year. Of course, that's very different from what happened previously, and then, the unemployment rate actually has some regular cyclical dynamics. Obviously, the pandemic was an extreme jump and then an extraordinarily rapid decline. I'm just going to use these two series in a very simple way. Okay. So what is the simple way? So my Bayesian decision maker, like I said, it's not most of Bayesian time series analysis related to inflation. It's much simpler, almost too simple. So my decision maker assumes an inflation process that the core rate of inflation in month T is a function of inflation over the previous 12 months, right? So I'm going to put n equal to 12 here. And literally, it's just, in this particular example, it's just over the previous 12 months. There's one coefficient, b of 1. The paper has lots of different specifications, different distributed lags. I also consider just looking at annual inflation, right? Not doing this sort of monthly. None of the points are important for the monthly dynamics, right? Every point I'm going to make comes out in annual data, right? And then there's a coefficient on the unemployment rate, right? That is, and there's idiosyncratic noise. That's this decision maker's view on the inflation process. So that's prior number 1. Inflation follows this process. And then he has a prior view on the coefficient. So if I just write this in the sort of really simple textbook form, and I'm talking like undergraduate econometrics, right? Right? There's just a parameter vector gamma, right? Dependent variable y, data x, and this person just estimates gamma. Now, how are they going to estimate gamma? Again, they're a Bayesian decision maker. They're not going to run the regression over that whole sample or over the last 20 years, right? Rather, this decision maker might be someone like me, right, who became an economist like in the late 1990s, right? And so I learned a lot about what inflation looked like or what it is, and I sort of had that prior view, right? I basically never ran a Phillips curve until the late 1990s. Everything that happened before that, sort of like history, it was something that I was aware of. So I'm this decision maker, right? And then I'm going to say, well, I have 20 years of data since I learned. I'm going to use that 20 years of data, different senses of what that history is, right? So they're going to have a prior over gamma, gamma tilde, and it's going to have some amount of dispersion and some central tendency, and then he's just going to do what's in the textbook. He's going to combine the prior with the data, right? The data is 2000 to 2019. I mean, it could be 2000 to 2021. That doesn't affect anything. And the prior is just some view of what those parameters might be. What is the prior I'm going to assume? Well, I'm going to actually calibrate that prior to just be what the least squares estimate are for 1960 to 1999, right? I'm actually then going to just say, well, how sensitive are results to having that prior view and combining it with the data just by loosening that prior a great deal, right? One could think of it as putting a weight on the prior, right? And one can like do a bunch of math and say, well, how much weight do I put on that prior? Really, right, if I put very little weight on the prior, right? So if omega goes to W goes to 0, right, I just have an uninformative prior. Like the variance of my prior becomes infinity, right? So that's what I mean by just having low weight. And I'm going to consider like weights of equal weights on the data and the prior, a weight of like 19 times on the data as on the prior, right? So that would be blowing up the variance by 20 times, right? So the data is relatively uninformative, or things like that. Okay, super simple.
This is a conjugate prior, right?
Yes, so this is exactly, and this is, and that's taking like the variance of the idiosyncratic shock as given, and this is sort of the conjugate. I actually did other things by actually having prior on the variance of the shocks and all of those things, and estimating all those things jointly. Nothing matters. Nothing. Those things don't affect. But this is like the simple conjugate prior for if epsilon is normal, and you take the variance of epsilon, or the error e, as given. Right, then this would be the conjugate prior in the posterior. Okay. One thing to note, right, is that the posterior is the matrix weighted average, more or less, right? That's what this is, of the least squares estimates and the prior, right? Where the weights on the prior and the least squares estimate are the precision of those two estimates, right? So that again goes back to this thing, which we'll get to again, that inflation was essentially constant at 2. If something is constant, right, and you're estimating the coefficient on that thing, how precise is your estimate? It has no precision because you can't estimate it. Right? I have a constant, right? So its precision is 0, or its variance is infinity. And essentially, that's what the results are. That the variance on any coefficients estimated over the last 20 years are essentially infinite relative to any reasonable prior. Okay. As I already went through these specifications, I'm just going to have the lags of 12. I also do it with annual data. The prior is just going to be the least squares estimate, and the weights go from a half to a completely uninformative prior. So here's what those priors look like for the monthly data or annual data, and for loosening them up with a weight of either equal weight, 1/4 weight, or 1/20th weight, right? So 19 times the weight on the data, right? Inflation was very persistent, right? It went up, and it took a really long time to go down, right? So any prior is going to think that, there's a really high chance that inflation is persistent, but, I'm going to let that variance on that precision explode. That is the set of coefficients on the left. The slope of the Phillips curve, it was actually quite steep as well, right? It was around a coefficient of -0.4, and somewhat precisely estimated, right? And so I'm going to let that be much wider, and then just combine the data, right? It's super duper simple exercise. So what happens, so the solid line, blue line, right, is equal weight on the prior and the data. The other lines are lower weight, and the sort of dotted bluish line, right, that is the uninformative prior. That is just the least squares estimate. Just estimate based on the last 20 years data. Okay? So what happens, again, for least squares, right, is that the coefficient on lagged inflation is essentially 0, and the coefficient on the unemployment rate is much closer to 0. It's not -0. It's like, about -0.15. What turns out to happen, right, is that if you put equal weight on the prior and the data, right, it basically says, well, ignore the data. Like, there's just nothing happened to inflation. Don't update. Your coefficient remains very close to 1, right? Nothing happened over the last 20 years. If anything does happen, look to what happened in the long past, because nothing's happened recently, so it can't tell you anything. The story is somewhat different for the slope of the unemployment rate, right? Because actually the unemployment rate has moved around a lot in the last 20 years. In fact, just as much as it did in the previous decades, right? So there's much more information in what the slope of a Phillips curve might be than there is for any persistence. And one can see that here by all of the estimates, no matter what your prior weight is, are that the Phillips curve is very flat, right? Whereas if your prior has a very large influence on the persistence of inflation, right? If you give any weight to pre-2000 experience, you're going to think that inflation is far more persistent because the recent data just don't tell you don't update very much. Okay, so the intuition is really simple, right? Recall that the coefficients are the matrix weighted average of the prior and the data, where the amount of weight you put on things, right, is the inverse of the variability of those x's, right? It's x prime x inverse, right? It's the inverse of the squared variability. So your data needs to be very variable for it to inform you about the coefficients. If your data doesn't move very much, it informs you very little about your coefficients. And right, what one can see here, right, because my prior actually, it's not a prior, right? It's the previous experience. It's the prior for someone like me, who's only 50, rather than someone like 75, for whom it would have been lived experience, as an economist. Right, what one sees is that in the recent years, inflation, its standard deviation is really, really low, and it's really low relative to that in the prior, right? So the prior is going to receive a lot of weight. Inflation used to move around a lot, so if inflation moves around a lot in the future, look back to that time where it moved around a lot, right? Don't look to the time where it didn't move, because if it doesn't move, it doesn't tell you what happens when it does move. In contrast, unemployment, right, the standard deviation of the unemployment rate in recent decades is actually larger than, and this is excluding the, it's actually excluding the COVID period. And it's actually larger than it was in the 60s through the 90s, right? The unemployment rate with the Great Recession, there was a, it's been very, its standard deviation exceeds that slightly. Right? So there's lots of variability in the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate is going to tell you about the coefficient, right? But inflation doesn't, so that's why you update for the slope of the Phillips curve, depending on your prior, but you do not update for the persistence of inflation. Okay. So, you know, the paper does, that was the super simple example. Everything in the paper is super simple, right? But there are somewhat less simple things, you know, like more general specifications for the Phillips curve, you know, and certainly looking at three different measures of prices, right? Different measures of core prices, the sensitivity to overall relative to core. None of those things matter. The results are literally basically exactly the same. And it's because there's nothing complicated going on here, right? It's that if inflation is constant, it won't tell you anything about when it's not constant, right? And inflation was more or less constant for 20 years. So now that it hasn't been constant, the data, you know, if you weight it with something else, say, well, don't look to that period where nothing happened, because something's happened. Okay. So, you know, what are the implications of these results, right? So you know, why are they interesting to me? Right? So again, like I said, I wrote this paper in, you know, December of last year, you know, updated it through the first quarter. So looking at the forecasts, right, for 2022 or 2023, this decision matters a lot of like, well, am I willing to do a Bayesian approach where I acknowledge that recent data hasn't done anything, so maybe I should look to a different period. If you do that, right, then if you put, so here's equal weight on the prior, 1/4 weight on the prior, 1/20th weight on the prior, right? All of those would have inflation, you know, close to 6 or 5.5%, you know, and again, this was at the end of last year in 2022, and staying near 5 or above in 2023. Of course, you know, just staying above 3 if you only place 1/20th of the weight, but still much higher, right? Whereas the forecasts, you know, of an uninformative prior, just using the last 20 years data, our inflation will drop to 3 and it will drop to 2 within a year. Okay? And at the time, right, if you look at this last quarter, those are exactly what the forecasts are of like the survey of professional forecasters, right? So the survey of professional forecasters, if they are using a Phillips curve framework, are saying anything that happened before the year 2000 is completely irrelevant. There's nothing I can learn about inflation in the future from that data. And of course, there are lots of, I mean, I've written papers like that as well. There are lots of reasons why that's a reasonable thing to think about, right? But this other approach of saying, well, I'm going to look at the data, and I'm going to acknowledge that actually not a lot has happened, and place different weights on other periods, not 0 weight on those other periods, right? Give you a very different view that inflation could be much more persistent. So, just to wrap up, right? Given a prior that inflation, you know, could be persistent, like history, you know, and almost any weight on that prior that's not 0, any reasonable weight, like 1/20th of the weight of what actually happened in the data, right? One would think inflation is very persistent, right? And so that has 2 implications, right? One is inflation, right? As of December 2021, you could expect it to be much higher in 2022 and 2023 than people were thinking. I think the second implication, which I think is much more important for this, well, as important, if not more important for this audience, right, is it's a research one, is that econometric approaches make a lot of assumptions. This is my specification, this is my data, you know, or this is my prior, and those, in a world where macroeconomic data actually often does not have as much information as you think, can really drive things. And small differences in priors, I would consider it a small difference in the prior to place 0 weight on history versus placing weight of 1/20 on that. They can have dramatic implications, right? And that was certainly true, you know, in the work that I've done, for example, on the equilibrium real interest rate, where most results there stem directly from the priors that people are bringing to their analysis, rather than what the data are actually telling them. So I think this phenomenon, you know, is more pervasive than people appreciate, and should be accounted for in empirical work.
Thank you very much, Michael. We have time for one or two questions. Okay, I'll start here.
Maybe a question or comment around the use of theory and structural approaches. Of course, part of the discussion was, well, why did we have this very different behavior in the 70s versus the last period? And what does it mean, projecting forward? And so, part of the discussion was, we have a different monetary policy regime. And I would argue that one of the advantages, of course, it comes with additional assumptions, but one of the advantages of doing a structural approach may be that you can maybe identify some of the specific sources of the change, which then may be helpful in your projection. So if you believe the main reason why we had the stable inflation period is because central banks did a much better job, and you think that the reaction function hasn't changed, then no. Again, you would put a lot more weight on the last period. Just.
No, and of course I agree. I mean, like, I cited a whole bunch of previous literature, and like one of those previous literatures was a paper that I wrote with Jean Boivin and Rick Mishkin, in which we estimated a structural model and argued that the change in inflation dynamics was related to the change in the monetary policy reaction function. So, and like I've written other papers and many, many others. So I completely agree. The question is just, right, in those other approaches, right, it's one way of looking at the data and one conclusion, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable one. But is it right? Or should we have confidence? Unconditional confidence, right? And like, part this is a research paper, right? But in part, like I wrote this at the end of last year because I was talking to people, and they just thought there was no chance that inflation was going to be high in the middle of 2022 or 2023, and I just thought that was wrong. There was a chance.
Sorry, there was another question. Oh, maybe.
I just wanted to make essentially the same point as Frank's, but that your approach, which I sympathize with, except for this potential Lucas critique applying to it, could be applied to a structural model. I mean, recognizing that the data in recent years may not offer grounds for identification of the relevant parameters, and then you use data for previous, for earlier episodes and so on, but always using a model in which parameters are invariant to policy change, because I think we all agree that there has been a significant change in the policy regime, rather than a reduced form approach, which is what you use.
Yeah, that's so absolutely right. So this is assuming that this sort of reduced form, backward-looking Phillips curve, which in many structural models will not be invariant to the Lucas critique, right? It's assuming that it is actually a structural model and that it's reasonable to have priors over that. And I mean, for example, the other work that I did on R-star, right, I'm actually doing something very different and having like a semi-structural model or a set of them and looking at those in the literature. And rather than looking at the data in this way, like looking at the sensitivity of those results to alternative priors on those and noting like how much the changes in the prior pass through to the posterior within that set of structural or semi-structural models. So I definitely endorse that other approach. That's not the approach taken here, but it's a perfectly reasonable one, and that's why I said in the beginning, right, that I'm going to do the approach of a Bayesian decision maker, not the right approach, right? It is an approach. I think it's informative on these issues, but I don't think it's correct. I think it's informative and something we should be thinking about.
So this is joint work with Francesco Bianchi at Johns Hopkins University and Donggo Song, who is at the business school of Johns Hopkins. Apologies if Donggo's name doesn't appear on the conference program. He recently joined the project. My name is Giovanni Nicolò. I work at the Federal Reserve Board, so the usual disclaimer applies. And this is a new paper it's the first time that we're presenting at the conference, so we very much welcome the comments and feedback. So the motivation for this paper is that there has been a recent revamp on theories that try to explain post-war U.S. business cycle fluctuations, and some of these theories point to a disconnect between real economic activity and inflation. In particular, these theories find that the drivers of business cycle fluctuations are shocks that resemble demand-side shocks that, however, don't have any inflationary effects. The empirical foundations for these theories is a paper by Angeletos, Collar, and Dellas, who look at the post-war sample and indeed find this evidence empirically. Other theories instead choose to explicitly abstract from the discussion about the relation between real economic activity and inflation, or alternatively, they rely on this empirical result of Angeletos and co-authors to basically avoid that discussion. So what we're doing in this paper is to provide an empirical study on the nexus between real economic activity and inflation with a focus on business cycle frequencies. And what we argue is that there are two key features that need to be taken into account to properly address this question. First, we need to purge measures of inflation and real economic activity from movements at frequencies other than business cycles, so both at higher as well as lower frequencies. And second, we need to adopt data on expectations, both on inflation and real economic activity, to properly extract these measures at business cycle frequencies. So what we do in this paper is basically to provide two pieces of evidence. The first piece of evidence is a simple motivating evidence that uses a bandpass filter on raw data. And given that motivating evidence, then we move to a more rigorous approach that has three steps. First, we will estimate a trend cycle VAR using data on on unemployment and inflation expectations, and here we are adopting an approach, an econometric approach that has been pioneered by Stock and Watson and has been largely used in the literature as well as from people in the audience. Then we will apply an identification strategy to the latent cycles in a way that we are going to identify shocks that drive the maximum share of the volatility of real business cycle. In particular, we will focus on the unemployment rate. Once we identify this shock, we will then evaluate what is the fraction of the volatility of the cyclical component of the other variables that is explained by the shock. What we find is that over the business cycle, we find an empirical nexus between real economic activity and inflation. In particular, we identified the shock that targets the cyclical component of the unemployment rate, and we show that it causes, is associated with a significant response of the cyclical component of inflation, and in particular, that shock can explain up to 50% of the volatility of cyclical inflation. We also offer a way to reconcile our findings with those of Angeletos and co-authors, and in particular, we argue that it's critical to extract these measures of real economic activity and inflation at business cycle frequencies. If this is not, if movements at the higher or lower frequencies are not properly extracted, then the shock that is identified by targeting real economic activity explains only 3% of the volatility of inflation, even if this identification of the shock happens at business cycle frequencies. So this, in this slide, I showed the first piece of simple motivating evidence. In particular, I'm reporting two panels. In the top panel, I report two series. The blue series is the cyclical component of the inflation, of realized inflation rate, that we extract by applying a bandpass filter at business cycle frequencies. The second time series in the top panel, the dotted orange line, is the corresponding cyclical time series for the log level of the real GDP per capita. The second panel shares the same time series for inflation as in the first panel, but then we also report the cyclical component of the unemployment rate obtained by using also a bandpass filter at business cycle frequencies. The key takeaway by looking at these two panels is that movements in cyclical movements in real economic activity, let them be measured in terms of unemployment rate or log level of real GDP per capita, tend to lead cyclical movement in the inflation rate. And we can see another way of seeing this key feature is by looking at this table in which we look at the correlations of the current cyclical component of inflation and its correlations with two variables. The first row shows the correlation with the cyclical component of the log level of the real GDP per capita at time t minus j, and the second row reports the corresponding variable for the cyclical component of the unemployment rate. So the last column, when j equals 0, basically reports the contemporaneous correlation between the cyclical component of inflation and the two measures of real economic activity. And as we move left in terms of the columns, we see that basically this correlation peaks with basically changes in real economic activity 2 or 4 quarters ahead are correlated with movements in the cyclical component of inflation 2 to 4 quarters ahead. Given this motivating evidence, then we move to adopt the more rigorous approach that I mentioned earlier. And in particular, we follow these 3 steps. We estimate a trend cycle VR model using data on expectation. We identify this shock using this max share identification strategy, and then we evaluate what is the contribution of this shock that explains business cycle fluctuations for the cyclical component of inflation in particular. So to start taking a stance on the model that we want to adopt, we first look at the data that we consider. In particular, the first set of 4 variables that I'm reporting here are quite standard and taken from the St. Louis Fred database. GT is the growth rate of real GDP per capita. Then we have UT, which is the unemployment rate. With FT, we denote the nominal federal funds rate. And then pi t is the inflation rate, which is measured by the GDP price index. To these 4 time series, we add 3 additional time series, which are taken by from the Philadelphia Fed Real-Time Data Research Center. In particular, we look at data that provides expectations for both unemployment rate and inflation. In particular, with this variable, we are including 4 quarters ahead unemployment rate expectations, and that's why we're going to denote it with the superscript 4. And then for the inflation measure, instead, we have 2 measures. One is the 1 year ahead inflation expectations, and the last one is going to be the 40 quarters or 10-year ahead inflation expectations. And here we're following, for the construction of this variable, we're following Del Negro and Eusebio that combine data on blue chip and survey of professional forecasters in order to construct this measure. So given these 7 time series, then we use the period between 55 and 59 as the pre-sample, and subsequently use the period between 1960 and 2019 as the estimation period. So given this data, then we need to make assumption about the trend cycle decomposition. Starting from the growth rate of real GDP per capita, we choose to decompose the variable GT into 2 components. tau g represents the trend in that variable, and then the term in parentheses, it represents the cyclical component, which is, however, expressed in terms of the log level of GDP. Therefore, as the difference between the current and the previous period in the log level. Subsequently, we look at the two variables that are related to the unemployment rate, meaning realized and the 1 year ahead expectations. And we decompose these two variables by assuming that they have a common trend, tau u, and then each of the two series has a cyclical component, which are denoted with a C. So then we're left with the inflation measures, and the measure of realized inflation we decompose as follows. First, we have a trend for the measure of inflation. We have a cycle, and then we also have a term that captures measurement error. And the goal for this assumption is that we want to purge the measure of inflation expectation from movements at higher frequencies. So we incorporate this term as which is expressed as the measurement error that is appended to the log level, the log of the price index, and then by taking the difference to define the inflation rate. That's why we have basically this term in the parentheses. But this is meant to capture basically the high frequency movements in realized inflation rate. We then have the two series for expected inflation, and these two time series share the same trend for inflation as for realized inflation, and then we assume that each of these series has its own cyclical component. Finally, as standard in the literature, we basically decompose the nominal federal funds rate by allowing for the trend in real, the R star trend, and the trend in inflation, and then a cyclical component. So given this, the assumption about this, the composition of the data, then we can stack the trends into a vector tau t, and the 7 cyclical components into a vector ct, and therefore we can express the measurement equation as the first equation here in blue, where yt represents the collection of time series that I just described, and then st represents the states, where we not only include the trend and the cycle at current time t, but also the lag of the cycle, this coming from basically the composition of the real GDP per capita, and the current and lagged measurement error that were coming from the decomposition of the inflation, realized inflation. So what we missed then to estimate the model is basically the transition equation, and we need to take a stance on how these state variables evolve. And in particular, as standard in the literature, we basically assume that the trends follow a unit root process, where the trends are subject to these shocks epsilon t, which follow a multivariate normal distribution, and the cycles also pretty standard, follow a stationary VR process, where each cyclical component is subject to a cyclical shock epsilon ct. So given this assumption on the evolution of the states, then we can also define the transition equation, and therefore the model as a whole that we're going to estimate using Bayesian methods. And in particular, we have the measurement equation at the top, the state transition equation here, and then we're also making standard assumption in the literature by having the shocks epsilon t, which correspond to the collection of the shock to the trend, cycle, and measurement error, to be independent of each other, therefore leaving this matrix, yes, having these blocks, 0 blocks in the variance covariance matrix.
And no time variation involved.
No time variation. Yes.
For inflation, stock and loss.
Yeah, no, that was the plan. Then yeah, Johansson and Meredith have been looking at the stock volatility. I think what we're where we are going to probably encapsulate that part of the possible time value volatility is likely going to be captured by the measurement error, because especially for inflation, that's where we see a lot of high frequency fluctuations over that period, and that's how we try kind of to extract that portion.
Stock and Watson, don't they find that it's the volatility to the trend of inflation that has dropped to zero, which is consistent with the change in the monetary policy regime? If that's the change, then probably it will bias your cyclical component, the estimation of the, you will get more persistent.
I think that for us, different from the previous paper, for example, it is important to really extract these trends and therefore obtain, actually, yeah, it's the next slide. So here I'm reporting, okay, for each series, so the red line corresponds to the data that we're using for the estimation, and the blue lines are the median of the latent trends, and the shaded areas are the 68 probability posterior density intervals associated with those latent trends. Here we can see that as we assume the trends to unemployment rate and the 1 year ahead unemployment rate are shared between the two variables, and a similar result can be found by assumption for inflation. So part of that possible kind of changes in the volatility may be captured by this measurement error, probably in this previous part. But for us, it's going to be important to have these trends, which again are meant to capture movements of these variables at frequencies lower than business cycle. So it doesn't necessarily have to be thought in terms of really long run U star, but these measures of trend really have to are aimed at extracting frequencies that are lower than the business cycle. So here I'm reporting the corresponding cycles in blue, and the red series are the same data that I was showing earlier. And we can see that by having that measure of trend for the unemployment rate, we can still see some fluctuations as well as movements in inflation at cyclical frequencies. An important difference that we're going to look at, that is going to be relevant when looking at the results for the role of the shocks for inflation, is the fact that exactly for the inflation measure, even when allowing for measurement errors, we see that still the cycle for inflation is still subject to some high frequency fluctuations. So we will focus mostly on these 1 year ahead inflation rate expectations as a measure of underlying inflation that can abstract from these high frequency movements. So here I'm report. So given the cycles that we the latent cycles that we extract from the estimation, then we can identify the shock, as I mentioned earlier, meaning, actually, if you don't mind, let me go back. Basically, we identify the shock by specifying a linear combination of the shocks to the cycle that explains the maximum volatility of the cyclical component of the unemployment rate. That's the step that allows us to identify the shock. And here I'm reporting the impulse response function to that shock. In particular, we see that the shock is going to lead to a drop in the shock corresponds to a drop in the cyclical component of the unemployment rate, and therefore corresponds to clearly an increase in the log level of the cyclical component of real GDP per capita, and a somewhat similar drop in the 1 year ahead expectations for the unemployment rate. And here we can see already kind of where the importance of this shock for measures of inflation. Indeed, you can see that in response to this demand-looking shock, that however differently from the other papers in the literature, here we find that basically it does have an impact on measures of the inflation rate, both realized as well as expected. And this is also associated with a positive response of the nominal federal funds rate. All these are for the cyclical components. So then we can look at what is, so the last step is then once we have the shock also to look at what is the fraction of the volatility that, for the other variables and their cyclical component is explained by this shock. So not surprisingly, clearly the shock explains a large fraction of the volatility of those cyclical components for all the variables that relate to real economic activity. But what is important and novel to relative to the existing literature is the fact that by properly extracting these business cycle measures for inflation and unemployment rate, we do find that this shock has an important role in explaining the volatility of this 1 year ahead, for example, measure of inflation expectations. Why? Because now we have this nexus that really allows to link movements between real economic activity and inflation at business cycle frequencies. Part of the reason for which probably this number, we are actually working on this project quite a bit, and here one way of reading the lower fraction of the volatility of realized inflation for coming from the shock can indeed be associated with the fact that the cyclical measure of inflation or realized inflation is still subject to some high frequency movements, but we're still working on this version, and some version actually then can further clean up that measure to achieve basically a similar estimate of that fraction of nexus between economic activity and inflation. So briefly, in the last few minutes, we would like to provide kind of some intuition for why our results differ from the ones of Angeletos, Collard, and Della's, and in particular we try to reconcile the two. And in particular, they follow a very similar three-step approach. The difference, however, there are two differences. One is that they estimate a VR or back-end specification, and second, they then recover the shock similar to ours, but then look at the role of the shock for movements in inflation at business cycle frequencies. We show that basically these two differences lead to different conclusions about the role of these shocks that drive business cycle fluctuations for inflation. And we try to provide this reconciliation by estimating the model, by shutting down the standard deviation of the trend components. And here I'm reporting again, like the red time series are the data, and then we have like the latent trends. And by assumption, by shutting down the shocks to the trend, they roughly correspond to the mean, right? So the cyclical component corresponds to the mean time series, and we apply the identification of the shocks to these cyclical components, but as they do in the paper, at business cycle frequencies. What we show is that the shock still explains a large fraction of the volatility of the real variables, but we basically find that that shock has very little explanatory power for the volatility of the resulting cyclical component of inflation. So to conclude, we argue in this paper that it's crucial to construct measures of inflation and real economic activity at business cycle frequency in order to capture this empirical nexus that we find in the data. And in particular, the shock that we identify as driving the cyclical component of the unemployment rate does lead to a causal response in the cyclical component of the inflation. And in particular, this shock can explain up to 50% of the volatility of this cyclical measure of underlying inflation. And finally, we provide a reconciliation of our finding with those of Angeletos and Collins. But but I'll stop here. I hope I'm in time. And I'll be very happy to receive
Thank you so much. Yeah. Why don't we start with?
So let me allow shameless self-promotion. So I have a paper with Luca Fosso that I wrote a couple of years ago that does a very similar exercise. And in the VR, we do include inflation from supply side. So we include oil shocks and we include imported supply materials. And we find that it is important actually to distinguish pre-Volcker and the post-Volcker period, going back to what Frank said. And we find a similar result as yours, meaning that, Phillips curve nexus, if you want, pre-Volcker, but not post-Volcker. And doing exactly the kind of Yuriy exercise. The shock to explain the volatility of domestic inflation is actually an international, we call it international supply inflation shock that comes from intermediate goods, imported intermediate goods.
Look into it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, maybe then I suggest we talk afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry for running late.
Maybe we both done for today. Well, thank you everybody very much. Thank you.